Hello, hello, and hello. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I'm going to be reviewing CDFM Module 2, Part 1 for today's session because I got to break it up into pieces because it's a lot of information. It's important for you to understand the processes that we discuss, the key players involved, the documents that they produce, when things happen, what event happens before the other, so that once I jumble all those things together, the success on the exam is you being able to, depending on whatever question is asked of you, that you're able to decipher the information and put the information where it goes. So we're going to go through that. Let me look at the breakdown of the exam again. Module 2, Competency 1, Defense Budget Process accounts for 33.6% of the exam questions. Module 2, Competency 2, Cost and Economic Analysis is 14.4%. Module 2, Competency 3, Strategic Planning and Organizational Performance Management accounts for 17.1%, so not many questions from that section. And Fiscal Law, although it's not a primary area in Module 2, Fiscal Law accounts for the majority of the question, which is 34.9%. Well, what does that mean to you if you're taking an exam? They don't tell me I need a 70 or 80 to pass. They're saying that the various sections are broken down into percentages of the amount of questions being asked on the exam. What that tells me and tells you is that you can focus your studies in that particular order. So if fiscal law has most of the question, I will start my studying. Once you do the initial review, and the point that we are at now is that you should be able to now focus on fiscal law, then defense budget process, cost and economic analysis, and then strategic planning. That's at the very end. But to get to that point, you need to also understand when you're taking a multiple choice exam, because I get this feedback all the time. People are saying, well, it had two questions that they were both correct. Both of those responses may be correct. What you need to ask yourself is, which one answers the question that they ask on the exam? Because you may read, if from 4 multiple choice responses, then 2 of those are easy, like have nothing to do with the topic. But you will most often have 2 of the responses. You read it and you're like, that one's right and that one's right. But you have to ask yourself, which one is more correct and which one is in line with what the question is asking me to do. Then you will know, based on the keywords and what you're told to respond to, then you will know what to answer to. That's how the percentages kind of help you out with the exam. Now, I will be honest with you. Module 2 appears to be the most difficult for most people to navigate. So that's why I recommend Module 1, then take your Module 3 exam, then move on to Module 2 exam. But initially, you want to read all of it. Before you even schedule any exams, read through Module 1, 2, and 3. Why do you say that? You might not even understand all of it, but what you will find once you complete all 3 exams, what you will see is a lot of the information in one section overlaps with same information in another section. But the difference is more information is given in one area than the other. So it's important for you to read the whole study guide first, then you focus on Module 1, for instance. And remember, some of the topics in Module 1 is in Module 2 and 3. So I just wanted to go over that again because of the difficulty with Module 2. Can you pass it? I'm a living witness. And prior to me taking it, I did no type of resource management. But based on those tools that I just mentioned, I use those ideas and test taking skills to navigate the exam. The key words is what I'm looking at. All right, so let's put that aside. So on the exam, they do not tell you what competency area you are dealing with. They will just ask you particular questions. You have to, based on the scenario, you have to answer the questions. The exam will not be directly stated exactly the way it is in the book. It is based on your knowledge, your understanding of what is going on. So you have to know the bits and pieces. So if they put it all together in a scenario, when you approach that certification exam, you have to think, okay, what do I know about that topic? Okay, and you be able to decipher all of it. All right, let's start the review. All right, so we're going to actually begin with the federal budget process because I have a one-page, I don't know if you can see, a one-page PowerPoint slide. If you do not have a copy of it and you can't, it's on one of the videos. If you can't see the video, you want me to send you the PowerPoint slide, just leave a note and I will give you my email address. It's somewhere on that YouTube, but I can give you an email address where you can send me an email and I'll email it to you. It's a PowerPoint slide I made up. It's not copywritten, nothing to do with ASMC. As I took the information, I put it in a PowerPoint slide, then I converted it with a slideshow type thing where once you put it in presentation mode, the items come in one at a time. I found that that tool helps as you go through the study. It starts to trigger things for you to remember. All right. So the operational chain of command, you got the mission of the Department of Defense to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, provide security, safety to our nation, our allies, all that good stuff. But understand this operational chain of command, because we're talking about Department of Defense and where it falls in line with the budget process. It runs from the president, a civilian, to the Secretary of Defense, a civilian, to the combatant commanders in NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, and all the other ones that we went over in the initial reviews. However, because the president and the SecDef are both civilians, they cannot often communicate to the combatant commanders, military folks, what they want them to do. So here comes the Goldwater-Nichols Act that designated the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff to be the spokesperson, for lack of a better word, for those combatant commanders, to translate the orders of the president, the Secretary of Defense, or another key player, the National Security Council, the NSC. So the National Security Council is our higher command in our country. The president is the president or the leader of the National Security Council. That is the primary forum that they discuss economical, political, focus, priorities, strategy for our country. The National Security Council has two standing advisors: the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which is the senior military advisor to that forum, the president and the SecDef, and the director of intelligence, national intelligence, so the director of intelligence. And so once the National Security Council gets together, they come up with what I call the big op order. What is our biggest focus for our country, for our nation? The big op order is the national security strategy. So what do you do with a big op order from your hire? You get the big op order and you look in it to determine what are your requirements. Let me take off these glasses for a minute. For your requirements for your organization. So the Secretary of Defense takes the national security strategy, looks for the defense-related things that the Defense Department is going to be responsible for doing so that they can meet the national security strategy, the Big Op order. So the SecDef, of course, cannot do it by himself. The SecDef provides our policy guidance, but of course, he has the Office of the Secretary of Defense supporting CAS. The SecDef looks to the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff for all the military strategy, all the military things that needs to be done to feed into the national defense strategy. So it comes up with a subordinate operation order based on the Big Op order. So the national military strategy is written by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. The chairman has Joint Chiefs of Staff, Army, Navy, Air Force. They have all those representatives, and one spokesperson is a chairman who then assesses everything that the combatant commanders send forward. All right, so let's see where we are. So your council, you got your chairman, national defense strategy. All right, so the Department of Defense, once they issue the national defense strategy, all right, this is what the DOD needs to do to meet the Big Op order, national security strategy. The DOD uses three DOD support systems. The three DOD support systems are JCID, Joint Capabilities, Integration and Development System, PPBE, Plan, Program, Budget, Execution Process or System, and the third one is the Defense Acquisition System. All three of those systems, remember the three circles, all three of those work intertwined together to meet the National Defense Strategy. So let's continue to tell the story. All right, so how does this work? Once the defense strategy is posted, the JCID process occurs. What is that? The Joint Capabilities Integration Development System is chaired by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. He knows what the chairman has already put out. He knows what the chairman needs to do. So he needs to be able to synchronize all of those efforts to meet the National Defense Strategy. So he chairs the JCID process or the JCID system. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff has a council, a board, which is the JROC, the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So the JROC is the one that does the analysis of the strategy. You can come up with a strategy on paper, but can you do it? Do you have the capabilities to do it? So what do they do in this analytical process? The JROC looks at an acronym that we call MLPF, Doctrine, Organization, Training, Material, Leader Development, Education, Facilities, all of those areas, material. When the JCID analysis is done, the JROC will then determine what are our capability gaps. What are we missing in our capabilities so that we can be able to meet that national defense strategy? So they come up with the problem, and then they also have a recommendation for a solution. What is it going to take to fill that gap? If it's in that MLPF, if it's doctrine we need to change, we need more personnel, more equipment, any one of those would trigger the PPBE system. However, if it requires a material solution to fill that gap, it triggers the Defense Acquisition System. So that's how those systems overlap. So JCIDs identify capability gaps by looking at the .MLPF. JCIDs is done by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the JROC. If it triggers anything other than material triggers the PPBE, we're going to move to that system. Plan, program, budget, execution. You're going to need to know who at the DoD is responsible for those areas. So don't forget, operational chain of command runs how? President gives the orders to the SecDef. SecDef gives the orders to the combatant commanders through the chairman of the the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, right? Because most instances, the SecDef is not consistently talking to the combatant commanders. The chairman is, or the other joint staff. And so when it comes to the PPBE process, keep that in mind. So once the defense strategy is published, then the combatant commanders, the commander of Northern Command, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, will then determine what are they lacking in their resources, because they don't own nothing. The services, the military departments own the resources, but the combatant commander is responsible for their region of the earth. So the combatant commanders will then come up with the IPLs, Integrated Priority List. Anytime you hear Integrated Priority List, IPLs, those documents are done by the combatant commanders. So that is how they list their requirements, their needs, and they submit it to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. They also send a copy to the Secretary of Defense, because that's their operational command. And they also send a copy to the military department, give them a heads up of what their requirements are. So the IPL is done by the combatant commanders. They submit to the chairman provides his assessment and recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. Then the Secretary of Defense will issue policy guidance out to the field. Then we enter the planning phase of PPBE, because after JCIS is done, they determine the initial capabilities document says that it's going to require some type of solution outside of a material solution. We don't have to build nothing or develop new aircrafts or new vehicles or a new system. We just need more money for more equipment that we already have in the inventory. So the planning phase of PEB is how we develop the plan to meet the national security strategy, because the national defense strategy meets the national security strategy. You got to keep it all in line. The person that's in charge of the planning phase of PEB at the DoD level is the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, USD for Policy. That individual will then run through all the planning, guidance, and so forth. And at the end of the planning phase of PEB, he publishes the defense planning guidance. So that the other agencies, you got to have some type of guidance before your subordinates can start developing their plan. So the USD for Policy will come up with the defense planning guidance. At the end, sends it out to the agencies. Before you move to the programming phase of PEB, you must know who's in charge of programming. And by the way, the budget estimate submission, the budget is done simultaneously with the programming phase. What is the purpose of the programming phase? The purpose of the programming phase is to translate that plan into allocation of resources. You know you're not going to get all the resources that you need, so you got to prioritize. So taking the programs, we got to prioritize which programs we want to request approval from Congress and how much budget for that upcoming fiscal year, because we got to do the budget every year. We need to request budget, so done at the same time. Who is in charge of the budgeting phase? Since we're talking budget, the USD comptroller. all the secretariats at the DOD level starts with Undersecretary of Defense. For policy, Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. But who's in charge of programming? Unfortunately, their title does not start with USD. The person in charge of the programming phase of PEEB is the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DK. So that's like your cost analysis person. So anytime there's cost, you're going to see the DK pop up throughout this entire CDFM. So the DK provides programming guidance. The USD Comptroller provides budget guidance, sends it out to the field so that we can start developing our POM, Program Objective Memorandum, which are the programs that we want to request, and the budget estimate submission, which is the budget we want to submit. So both are done by two different channels at the same time. So in the programming phase of PPBE, we talk about the combatant commanders submitting the IPLs. They submit their requirements. Part of that to the military department, because the combatant commanders do not submit their own. I think other than SOCOM and DLA, they have their own POM process and budget process. But everyone else, all the combatant commanders, the other ones, submit their request to the military departments, and the military department puts it in their POM for whatever the requirement is if they don't already have it. So that goes to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff provides his assessment, recommendation, up to higher at the DOD level of SecDef and the various forums and boards. They make a decision in the program. The final document at the end of the programming phase is Program Decision Memorandum. Now, let me say this, because depending on if you get a 2018 exam, you may see the term RMD, Resource Management Decision. The oldest study guides said that the final document in the programming and budgeting phase, it was the RMD, Resource Management Decision. But the new study guide, the 2020 study guide, which is what we're using, states that the final document in the programming phase is Program Decision Memorandum, and the final document in the budgeting phase is the Program Budget Decision. So make sure you can differentiate. So I had to say that a few times because sometimes I get both of those mixed up. But it's Program Decision and Program Budget. All right. So the DCAPE is responsible for updating the DoD database that keeps track of the resources, the services, the major force programs. So all the programs, the resources, the resourcing necessary to operate those programs, the DCAPE, cost analysis guy, right? He's responsible for updating a database called the Future Year Defense Program, or FIDEP. All right, start squinting again. All right. On the budgeting side, so we said the USD Comptroller is in charge of the budgeting phase. The USD Comptroller also has to keep track of, as they move through the budget estimate submission process, decisions are made, yes, no, increase, decrease. The CIS is a Comptroller Information System, keeps track of the budget numbers. And then those numbers are submitted to Office of Management and Budget, because that's the higher. Office of Management and Budget is the resource manager, is the chief financial officer for the executive branch or the president. And so during the fall review, the OMB sits down with USD Comptroller to go over the POM, to go over the budget. Because again, they're not just going to take what we request. They want to know why How much did you spend back then? Why didn't you execute those funds? Yes, no. Once the OMB makes a final decision on what's going to be sent forward to the president, for the president to send to Congress for the budget, then it's called the OMB passback. That is the final decision that is sent forward for the program and the budget. Now, what happens? By law, it says that the president must submit the budget to Congress no later than, so it's not by the first Monday, it's no later than the first Monday in February of the year prior to that 1 October new fiscal year beginning. And if you look under Article 1, Section 7, that is where it also states some of the things that will happen once the president gets the bill or the budget. So let me not jump the gun. Let's say, okay, the president submits the budget to Congress. What does Congress do with it? So prior to the president submitting the budget to Congress, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, which is came out of the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. The CBO is like the accounting or accountant for Congress. So the CBO starts gathering the historical data. What's our deficit? What's our historically, how much have we spent? Revenue, how much have we taken in? So all of that data is given to Congress. And I'll tell you which Congress in a minute. We'll talk about that. Because once the president submits the budget to Congress, the first phase of congressional action is the budget resolution process. There's one House and one Senate that's responsible for the budget resolution process, and that is the House and Senate Budget Committee. The House will look at the budget, will come up with the guidelines. So what the budget resolution process is the House and Senate determining what guidelines they're going to use to limit, to control what is approved for the president's budget, the PresBud or the federal budget. So the budget resolution is a concurrent process. It does not go to the president for the president to sign because it doesn't make sense. Congress is determining what guidelines it's going to use. They're going to vote on it. They determine if there are any discrepancies. The House and the Senate has to come together. And when the House and the Senate comes together, what is that called? A conference committee. And what is another name for the conference committee? It's the third chamber. So what is the purpose of the conference committee? If the House and the Senate do not agree on something, they have to come together to resolve differences. So whenever they come together to resolve the differences, then that is called a conference committee or the third chamber. Now, it doesn't matter if the House sends 5 members, the Senate sends 2 members. Who has the majority? Nobody, because this one is speaking for the House as one body. This side is speaking as a Senate for one body, and together they have to come to a resolution because only one document. So if it's got to go to the president, only one document goes forward. Even if it doesn't go to the president, they have to come to a resolution, concurrent budget resolution. And then you have the authorization process. So remember the POM, right? Program Objective Memorandum. At the DoD level, we're doing the POM. The POM are the programs, the major force programs that we want to operate. I think it's 11 of them. 11 major force programs that we want to operate. So out of that, we pick ones. So that goes through the authorization, the authorizers. Then on the budget side, the budget estimate submission goes through the appropriators. And so which House and which Senate is responsible for the authorization process? That's reviewing our POM Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. They're responsible, and the process is the same. The House and the Senate Committee, Armed Services Committee, reviews the POMs, then, or the POM data, the program data. I hate it when it says low, but we're going to continue and see how this works out. All right, reviews the data, then they have differences. They have to come together in the third chamber or the conference committee. Then once they come to a consensus, the difference from the budget resolution to the authorization is the authorization must go to the president, again, for the president to sign for it to become law. Likewise, on the appropriators, the appropriation must also go to the president for the president to sign for it to become law. The only purpose of the authorization law is to authorize programs. So it doesn't matter if funding is listed in the authorization process. It doesn't matter because they cannot give you any money in the authorization process. They're authorizing the category of things that you're allowed to do in that upcoming fiscal year. The appropriators, once they give you funding, then you have the budget authority, the money to spend on those programs, depending on whichever programs they tell you they're giving you money for. What am I talking about? So I'm going to give a simple example. The Authorization Act is done by one House, one Senate, which is different from the appropriators. The authorization process may goes to the president, it's signed, it becomes law. They authorize the program for you to do a particular job, a particular program, and they say, we'll give you $5 million in the authorization. And then on the other side, the appropriators appropriate for the same program $2 million. How much funding do you have? 5 million or 2 million? You have $2 million to spend, even though on the authorization side, it listed this program is approved for 5 million, but on the appropriation side, they only appropriated 2 million for that program. You only have 2 million. So don't get confused with the words authorization. And an example of a question, I've seen it a long time ago when I got my certification, is the authorization process authorizes appropriation of funds for particular programs. Is that true? Authorization authorizes appropriation for a particular program. Yes, it's true. But do I have budget authorities? Keywords, right? Do I have budget authority to spend that money on those programs? No, I do not. So what I'm saying is, again, I said it earlier when I started, when you're dealing with multiple choice questions, yes, because I've been a test writer. 2 of the responses will clearly be nothing to do with that topic. 2 of the responses, if you read them, they're true. But the question is, are they answering what was discussed in the question? What's the question telling you to do? Which one of those best answer what the question was asking for? So I'm going to reiterate that a lot because they get nervous and they're like, oh, that's true. Oh, yep, that must be the right answer. But the question didn't ask you for that, right? All right. So we're still on the execution part of it, getting to Congress. So now we have an authorization law authorizing the POM category of programs. We have an appropriation law because the president signed those. And now we have appropriation. So the execution phase begins in the PEEB once Congress appropriates the fund. Now, what's the significance? Oh, battery low. All right, so I'm going to close up this in a little bit because my battery's getting low. What's the significance of the appropriation law is based on Article 1, Section 9. No money can come out of the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law or a temporary appropriation law, which is a continuing resolution. So it's significant when Congress appropriates the money, two things happen. Treasury issues the Treasury warrant, which is the legal part tied to that Constitution. Yep, we got the appropriation law. The money has been set up. You can start spending, but not really, because on the other side, OMB, Mother May I, has to give you your apportionment. So Congress appropriates, then OMB begins the apportionment process. The agencies such as Department of Defense, the USD Comptroller, must submit an SF 132 document within 10 days requesting that they receive their appropriation amount or apportionment. The SF 132 is an apportionment document. And then OMB has 30 days or a month to issue the apportionment. So Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, DOD issues allotments to the rest of us. Everybody that falls under the Department of Defense gets allotment. Then we commit administrative reservation of funds, obligate legally binding the government. So you can legally bind the government with a contract. You can legally bind the government with a MIPR. So there are different agreements that fall under that big umbrella of obligation. And then we outlay or disperse, but the CDFM is going to talk about outlay. That is the official term for once the funds are removed from the Treasury and pay that bill, that's an outlay. So I'm going to stop there. And then I'm going to move on to, once we did the JSID,